Blessings of same-sex couples okayed? Death penalty inadmissible? Masculinity is sinful? The Church of Change, here and now? Using runaway headlines and warped narratives, the mainstream media couldn't be happier to stoke the flames of confusion inside and outside the church. In this episode of the EDIFY Podcast, Archbishop Joseph Naumann of Kansas City helps squelch the confusion while unpacking the infamous Fiducia Supplicans document's potential intent but troublesome outcomes, as well as the church's teachings on sin, masculinity, the death penalty, and Taylor Swift? Welcome to the EDIFY Podcast, Your Excellency. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mary. It's a privilege to be with you and your listeners.
I was thinking when I was getting ready for this, how long you and I have known each other. And I know I was still Mary Hallen, so that's at least 25 years ago, and you were Father Joe. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on the EDIFY Podcast, because I've had the opportunity to hear you a couple of times talk about your family story, about the death of your father and working through the forgiveness needed there, and as well as, you know, what your mother had to go through after your father's death. Can you tell for our audience members who might not be familiar with your family story what happened?
Yeah, so my mother was pregnant with me, actually, and it was December 18th in 1948. I'm really old.
Well, you don't look it. I would never have guessed.
And but anyway, my father went to work that day and never came home. He was murdered at his job. He was a foreman, and he had sent an employee home because he was drunk. And the employee came back angry, and he stabbed my father, and unfortunately died almost instantly. So this is a week before Christmas. I have one older brother who's about 2 years older than I am. And so this obviously was a great trauma in the life of our family, but I was immune to it. You know, I was in my mother's womb. I didn't know what was going on. But when I got to be a teenager, I started asking family members and friends. And actually, you know, it wasn't until I was almost a teenager, I think, that I even knew the name of the man who killed my father, because my mother never focused us on that. She challenged my brother and I not to consider ourselves victims. She said, you know, this is a loss, but you're blessed. Always remember you're blessed in so many ways. So she didn't allow us really to focus on that. And when I talk to family members and friends of my parents, and I would say, what was that like? And they would say to me, well, you know, your mother and father had a beautiful relationship. She really grieved your father's death. But, and she didn't believe that God wanted your father to die the way that he did, that was the result of sin. But she believed that God was still with her, and that God could even bring good out of this tragedy. And that's kind of how she approached it. And so I'm so grateful for that, because I think it can be a dark hole that can, you know, people can get absorbed with anger towards the perpetrator. And most times it doesn't affect the perpetrator, but it affects those that have been the victims. And so, you know, I think, I think we need, as a church, we always need to be conscious of families that have been victims of violent crimes and surround them with a loving community. I think that's really what helped our family.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how did your mom, you know, how many months later were you born after your father's murder?
So I was born in June, so I was born like 6 months later. What my mom did, she went back to college and she got a degree in education. She got a scholarship to be able to go back to college. And then she actually became a Catholic school teacher. She had never gone to Catholic school herself. That's a whole nother story. But and she eventually became a Catholic school principal. And you know, I think about that in some ways. When I was an auxiliary bishop in St. Louis, and I would be out in the parishes celebrating confirmations afterwards when you would take pictures with the newly confirmed and their sponsor and parents. Oftentimes one of the sponsors or sometimes one of the parents would come up to me and they wanted to talk to me, but they didn't care that I was a bishop. They wanted to talk to me because I was Mrs. Naumann's son. And they wanted to tell me the difference that she made in their lives, particularly in helping them to grow in faith and love for Jesus and the church. And so as I look in retrospect, that was one of the great goods that God drew out of this tragedy.
And your dad had been a semi-professional baseball player, correct? Or was...
Yeah, he had played in the minor leagues for the Cardinals. He was a catcher, and he caught Stan Musial, who was probably the greatest St. Louis Cardinal. But when Musial was a pitcher in the minor leagues, before they figured out he was a much better hitter than a pitcher. But the Second World War had interrupted my father's baseball career. After the war, he didn't really go back to that. He played semi-pro ball in St. Louis, and he's actually in the Amateur Hall of Fame in St. Louis. And my mother made sure that my brother and I, we were baseball fans as a way of keeping memory of my father. But yeah, I wonder if I would have become a priest if my father had lived, because the priest in our parish, I think they took a special interest in my brother and I because we didn't have our biological father, and we had many priests that were friends of the family, and so I grew up seeing the importance of the priesthood and the great gift that it was. So, I think my mother's awareness of her faith that God was still with us, that he doesn't promise us that we'll never have tragedy or suffering, but what he does promise us that we'll never be alone in that. And right. I think that witness to me was profound, and her confidence that God could still bring good even out of this terrible tragedy was a great blessing.
Well, what happened then to the man who killed your father?
So he did go to jail. I don't know how long he spent in jail. I think it was less than 10 years.
And do you know if the death penalty was ever considered as a possible punishment for him?
Yeah, I'm not really sure that. I would imagine it was legal back then.
Yeah, well, if he was intoxicated, then that's certainly a mitigating circumstances,
right.
That a jury will often take into consideration. And, so sometimes it's an aggravated manslaughter or, I'm not sure what the criminal code would have called for back in those days. But you yourself have been quite outspoken against the death penalty, and you often cite your own family's experience. And can you unpack that a little bit? I know one of the things I found most moving when you discussed this was that, putting this man to death would not have brought your father back.
Yeah, I think sometimes we, that on the victim's part, a misplaced hope that somehow the execution of the person that caused the death of a loved one is going to bring peace or serenity. And in my experience of walking with families in this, it really doesn't. I think they can become so focused on that to me it becomes an obstacle of moving on with their lives and not becoming so absorbed with that. And I think part of it, though, is, I think we need as a society to be much more conscious of victims of violent crimes.
Yeah.
And to help and support them more.
Right.
And to surround them. As I say, I think that's what happened with our family. We were really surrounded by community, family, but also the church community that really helped us and to move forward with our lives and not become overly absorbed with what happened to the perpetrator.
And not become victims yourselves. As you pointed out, your mother tried to impart that to you, that you were not victims. And I mean, at least not to think of yourself that way. And well, when Evangelium Vitae was released, there was, quite a stir, I think, mostly in the secular media because of what some interpreted as a change in the church's teaching on the death penalty, when it was really, to my mind, just more of a refinement. Can you explain what St. John Paul II did in Evangelium Vitae with regards to the death penalty?
Yeah, I think he challenged society to that he didn't say that the death penalty could never be used, but he thought in Western civilization and culture that there was it's very rare for there to be a need for it. Mm-hmm. In other words, to protect society, that there are other ways that we can protect society. And that the rehabilitation of the efforts to bring about the conversion of the one who's committed the crime is important.
Right.
And that, it's not the same. It can't be made equal, for instance, with abortion. In one case, you're talking about an innocent child's life that's being taken. But life is sacred, and if we can protect society, and if we can rehabilitate the individual, that's what we need to do as a culture and society. That, I think John Paul felt that when we rely on the death penalty, it makes us as a society resort to the destruction of human life, and it's a bad signal for us as a culture and society that there are better ways for this. So, he didn't say that there could be no justification for the death penalty, but he said he thought it was very rare.
Right. So just almost not impossible, but close to it to justify it. At least in, as you pointed out, in more developed Western countries. But what about what Pope Francis has said now? Pope Francis seems to have come up with a new formulation is about the best way I could describe it, that he refers to the death penalty as inadmissible, which is not normally a word we see in moral theology. I'm not sure exactly what he means by that. Do you have any insights into what Pope Francis is saying? I know the catechism's been revised, but when you talk to people about its the practical implications, there seems to be a lot of confusion.
Yes, yeah, I think there is, but I think it's another way of trying to articulate what John Paul had said previously by saying inadmissible, so that he wasn't saying that it would always be morally wrong, but again, in a culture where there is the ability to protect the society without destroying another life, that's my interpretation of what Francis is really saying with this. That I think he, and some of the things that he has said, that he thinks it's never appropriate. I'm not sure that I agree with them. Again, I think for 2,000 years, capital punishment has been accepted within the church as something that can be a necessary protection for society. Right. And I think there's still some societies where that may be true.
Right. Some limited circumstances, but yes, it's not. And well, there's some, noted Catholic commentators like Ed Feser and Josh Mercer who have said that changing church teaching on the death penalty would also pave the way for the church to change its teaching on things like same-sex couples. And do you see a link there? Hasn't this now kind of essentially come to pass in certainly in the secular law? Now we see same-sex marriage as a given, but now we're seeing some I'm not sure what to call them, developments or changes in how the church is viewing same-sex couples. Do you see any link there with these sort of timeless teachings being altered and then having a domino effect?
Yeah, I don't see an immediate connection. I think there is and this goes before Francis, what the church has talked about development of doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
And Francis himself would say, but that it always has to be in continuity with what the church has previously taught.
Right.
The new statement by the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith about being able to bless, in some sense, those with same-sex attraction, that's resurfaced this. But if you read that document, it's very clear that the church cannot liturgically bless a same-sex marriage or couple. And it's because of the moral problem of that relationship that it's impossible for us to do that kind of blessing. But then they make this distinction that there's another type of blessing. Not everything is a sacrament. Not everything is blessed in a liturgical setting. So, and it's true, we priests were approached by people to bless things and bless people all the time, and we don't investigate them to see if what
Right.
their moral status is. I think it's more we pray for everybody and we pray for their conversion. This is part of what, I think is in Pope Francis's heart. It's always, how do we invite people in? How do we help them to come out of where they are into relationship with the Lord? So I think that's what the hope is. What
Right.
I found confusing in that document was the use of the word couple, because I think that is reinforcing, we're blessing the relationship.
Right.
And there's something, we can't really bless something that is morally harmful to the individuals that are in it. We can pray for them, and we should pray for them.
Right.
And
bless them individually.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, and I remember when Pope Francis was the Archbishop of Argentina and gay marriage was being debated there, and he called same-sex marriage an anthropological regression, which is very strong language.
Yeah.
And then, we see Jesuit Father Jim Martin with a gay civilly married couple in front of him, giving them a blessing. So it was very clear what was implicated there. How do we correct then the record? I mean, or is the horse too far out of the barn, Archbishop? I'm not sure about what's allowed and what isn't allowed in so far as these blessings are concerned.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things the document says is that whatever we do, it shouldn't be to confuse people about what our teaching is about the sanctity of marriage. And I think what you just described, it's obviously not doing what the document is called for. It's obviously trying to confuse people. And I think part of the confusion is that those with same-sex attraction, when they're asking for a blessing, they're not asking us, couples that I've been aware of in these relationships, they're not asking us to just pray for them. They want us to validate.
Yeah, I've already had priest friends tell me that literally within an hour of that statement coming out, they were receiving calls from, same-sex attracted couples in their parishes asking when they could set their blessing up.
Yeah.
Within an hour, that was starting to happen. So,
right. And part of that is the way the secular media reported it. Because if they read the document, they'd see that really wasn't an option. But unfortunately, there are some priests that are also confused, and they'll begin to do exactly what it says not to do.
Right, because the Austrian Bishops' Conference now says priests now cannot say no to blessing homosexual couples. So if it's not a mandate, why does that sound an awful lot like a mandate to me?
I think the Austrian bishops need to go back and read actually what the dicastery said, because, again, we're praying for individuals to grow in holiness, and part of that is to overcome. We all need friendships.
Yes.
We all need good friendships. And so that's what we pray for. But what I find lacking is we don't talk enough about the virtue of chastity.
Mm-hmm.
And we almost give the impression that the church's teaching on human sexuality is this great burden.
Yeah.
But chastity is something that liberates us and it leads us to a fuller life. And it's the culture that's trying to lure us into these destructive relationships and behaviors. And we can't change the teaching that Jesus himself has given us about marriage.
Yes.
And that teaching is It's not a burden, it's a protection. Marriage is a call to heroic love because it's of its permanency and its completeness and its openness to life.
Mm-hmm.
You have beautiful organizations like Courage,
Mm-hmm.
where you have people with same-sex attraction that are living chaste lives and, are fully embracing the church's teaching. And they find this to be liberating, to be helpful. And I think, again, some of this confusion begins to say to them, well, why are you doing this? You can do what the culture says. And so that's what I think was inevitable by this document, that it would lead to a lot of confusion, yes. Unfortunately.
Right. Well, like you mentioned, that your take on what the Austrian bishops have now mandated is that they haven't understood the document. And so, but who enforces the corrective here? Does the Holy Father need to do that to the Austrian conference directly? Or is it, I'm not sure how one, is there, I'm just asking process wise, is there a process?
Well, theoretically, every bishop in the world reports directly to the Holy Father. So that's where the authority for that rests. Right. But we see this in, the Acts of the Apostles, and, even Peter is corrected by Paul.
Right.
On occasion. So we bishops, I think, have some responsibility to challenge each other about these things. I don't think it's compassionate to try to tell people that they can do something that's really harmful to them.
Right.
Our moral teaching it's not meant to be restrictive, it's meant to be protective.
Yes.
And so I think clarity in that teaching, personally, is, I think, an act of great compassion and concern and care.
My mother always used to say, God gives us laws to make us happy, not to make us sad, but to make sure that we're happy as you can be. And on this side of the veil, as they say. Well, just shifting gears, just briefly, Archbishop, the Holy Father has also made another slightly confusing comment about the church being too masculine. Which, just as someone who worked in the church structure for many years, I found kind of funny, because I think every parish and rectory, et cetera, is dominated by female employees or female volunteers. What's your perspective on what he meant by that?
Yeah, I think he was indicating, and he said this in other places, that we need, wherever possible, to take advantage of the gifts of women in leadership positions within the church. Now, I think he's been clear about, we can't really change the teaching on male ordination. But, the administrative team that I have here that counsels me, at one point it was the majority were women. Our superintendent of schools was a woman. Our director of Catholic Charities is a woman. Our CFO is a woman. So I think a lot of places that's happening already within the church, but I think that's what he's alluding to. And of course, John Paul, he talked about the feminine genius,
right.
And so we need to tap into that in the church, and I think never at the expense of part of what the feminine genius is motherhood, and what an important vocation that is, and not every woman is called to biological motherhood, but sadly, our culture has really diminished the importance of that, and I think we're suffering as a society because of that. And I think women have gifts that they can bring to every level of the church, but never to discount them being the heart of the family.
Right. Right. Yeah, you look in the Jewish community, when the men return from synagogue on Friday nights, they sing a song to the mother, who's the center of the Jewish home, and praising her. But when John Paul spoke of the feminine genius as beautifully as he did, it also implies that there's a masculine genius, that men have gifts to bring to the church as well. And what kind of concerns me about that is, again, it's possibly not what the Holy Father meant, but not to discard the gifts that men bring to the church.
No, and I think there is a lot of confusion among males, frankly, because I think maybe not the church so much, but the society has become feminized in many ways, and men don't know what their role is anymore, and so we, it's so sad when I talk to young women and they say we can't find marriageable men.
Yes, that's there's a new book out this year about that. I think it's called like Men Adrift or something like that. Yeah. But how, young men used to aspire to having a family, to having a wife and a family and building, that kind of life for himself. And now you don't see that as a priority for a lot of young men anymore.
Yeah, and part of it is, I think, the breakdown of our sexual morality has really affected them, and addiction to pornography and even just to computer games.
Right.
As opposed to of being men of responsibility. That's where I think Bishop Thomas Olmsted, in the pastoral letter that he wrote challenging men into the breach, for men, we're called to be protectors of women and spouses, protectors of society and culture, and willing to make heroic sacrifices for the good of those that are entrusted in some way to our care. And so I think one encouragement that I had just recently, we had what many dioceses have, what are called quo vadis retreats. So this is for young men, usually they're towards the end of high school or into college or maybe already working. And when I first got to the Archdiocese here, we'd be happy if we had 10 young men that would come to these. We just had one in December. We had 82 young men.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And so I see that there's a lot of hope, but we really need to pay attention in terms of mentoring young men to be truly men and to live lives of generosity and service and have courage and boldness.
Yeah. And well, when you first became chair of the U.S. Bishops Pro-Life Committee, there were some calls for your resignation from a group called Faith in Public Life because of your criticism of President Biden, particularly his attempting to reconcile his Catholic faith with unbridled support for abortion. And we were at Catholic Vote happy, of course, to get, I think, 10 times the signatures that they managed to get. But how did that, you were just starting in your role at the committee. And of course, in the pro-life movement, you had been, well known for years and beloved. And everyone was so thrilled that you were elected to this position because, like, as I was telling people, you knew all of us, we knew you, you could hit the ground running because you knew all the players in the pro-life movement and all the good work and et cetera, et cetera. And so, what everyone in the movement saw as a terrific choice among the bishops was, decried simply because I think you said what everybody else was thinking. I mean, how did that impact your term as the pro-life chair, or did it not?
It didn't. I've been kind of used to those kind of criticisms, having been part of the pro-life movement for a long time. And, just recently I was actually at a family gathering and one of my relatives said to me, well, we wish you weren't so political. And I said, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, it was kind of the same thing,
Yeah.
Your criticism of the president. And I said, look, I said, when politicians begin to say, hey, I'm Catholic, I'm a devout Catholic, this is what Biden, that was his mantra during the campaign in the early days. And then, but I'm going to, I'm going to do everything I can to protect the killing of children, which is what, we sanitize the language a lot, but, and he trumpets this as this great human right. Abortion is a human right. It's a woman's right. Well, what is it? It's the killing of our own children. And so when a Catholic politician says that and says, I'm Catholic and I'm doing this, then he's usurping my role and the other bishops' roles as teachers of the faith. And I feel I have an obligation to correct him because he's scandalizing in the way the church uses that term. He's leading people to confusion and misunderstanding. So I mean, there are people that don't like that, but that's my responsibility, and that's, I think, every bishop's responsibility.
Sure. And you're the one that has to stand before the Almighty someday and give an account, right? Yeah. Not them, right? And so, it reminds me a little bit of what the actress Patricia Heaton from Everybody Loves Raymond once said, when she was asked how she handled criticism from others in Hollywood who were so angry about her pro-life stand. And she said, when I die, I'm going to have to stand in front of someone and give an accounting for my life. And that someone is not going to be Oprah Winfrey. It's going to be someone far more important. So that's what I'm worried about. I really don't care what others think. But, thank you for your leadership during that time, Archbishop, for, kind of taking those slings and arrows, for the church and for the church's teaching. It was very much appreciated. Well, I know you're a great sports fan. And because you're in Kansas City, I have to ask this question. I think you probably know what's coming. Have you met Taylor Swift and or Travis Kelce, and what do you think?
Well, no, I've not met Travis Kelce. No, I've not met Taylor Swift.
I was hoping you'd have some scoop for us that we could break some big news.
Well, we have a former Anglican priest here who works up at Benedictine College, and he wrote an interesting article about them, just saying that he saw some hope in their relationship from the sense that Taylor Swift didn't immediately start dating Travis Kelce. She made him work for it. And he also said, it's good to see her when you see her at the football games. She's always with his family.
Yes.
And how good relationships bring families together, not just individuals. And so she's a celebrity, and I think she's misguided, like so many are, on her approach to the sanctity of human life, and mistaken on abortion. And Travis Kelce, I think he's a great tight end. But I hope that they will have a virtuous relationship. And there's a vocation crisis in our country, and it's not about priests and it's not about religious sisters. We do need more priests and religious, but there's a crisis about marriage right now.
And she has so many young women, who just idolize her.
Yeah.
And so, again, a good, healthy marriage can really be something that she can contribute, to this culture that's so, so disposable in so many ways. So, thank you for letting me ask that question, Archbishop. Well, just as we're wrapping up, Archbishop, can you recommend a saint for us? Not like your favorite saint or your patron saint, but, the best saint for this difficult time that we're in. Is there anybody that comes to mind whose intercession we should be thinking about, or whose work we should be reading, to give us some sort of guidance about it? It's a very divided time in the church, and very, very upsetting for a lot of people. And what would you recommend for those of us who are really struggling right now with what we're seeing play out in the church?
I know you said not your favorite saint, but one of my favorite saints is Thomas More. And I really think the title of the play and then the movie about him, A Man for All Seasons, I think it's really true. And if you really read about Thomas More, he was an amazing intellectual. But he had great wit and humor and prudence, wisdom. It was not any mistake that he rose to the position that he did in England as next to the king, being the most influential political force in the country at one point. But he was an incredible family man and very generous and care for the poor. And so I think he's just a great example of integrity, of being true to what the church teaches, even when the consequences to that could be, it brought him to martyrdom. And he did everything he could to avoid martyrdom. But in the end, he would not compromise the truth.
Right.
And I just find him so edifying, and he's a real hero. But there's many others, I think Gianna Molla is somebody that's such a great saint for our time, and this medical doctor, and her willingness to risk her own life, the life of her child, who's now this great...
As a doctor herself.
Yeah, doctor herself.
And, and like Thomas More, she did everything to try to avoid it. She wasn't, being reckless. She had other children to care for, but, she died of sepsis, which is, I suppose, a risk. It would have been a risk even if she had had the abortion that she was, encouraged to have.
There's so many great saints to be our friends at this time. And I think, especially now in the U.S., as we're focused on this Eucharistic revival, somebody like Carlo Acutis is another amazing saint that the Lord's raised up at this particular time for us. So,
with the Eucharistic miracles that he documented. And you just think of someone that young and didn't have much of a lifespan, but my goodness, the number of people he's impacted.
Yeah.
Well, listen, thank you again for making so much time for us so close to Christmas. We wish you a very wonderful and prosperous and holy New Year.
Thanks, Mary. God bless.
Thank you for listening. To make it easier for you to listen to future EDIFY Podcast episodes, please make sure you subscribe over at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thank you.